I signed the lease on our new apartment on a Tuesday. By the following morning, my wife was gone. She hadn't just walked out, she had cleared out nearly everything we had built together. Most of the money from our joint account had disappeared. What she left behind fit into 3 images I still can't forget. An empty suitcase standing open in the bedroom, divorce papers already signed on her side, and her 20-year-old sister, Sophie, sitting alone on the couch, staring into nothing. There was no phone call, no explanation, no final conversation, only a short note on the kitchen counter written in her familiar hand. "Take care of Sophie, I can't." That was 7 years ago. And just last month, I walked into a place Lillian never imagined I would enter. She looked up, saw me, and all the colour drained from her face when she noticed who was standing directly behind me. But before I tell you what happened in that room, I have to go back to who I was before everything fell apart. Back to the version of me who believed life could be kept orderly if you just stayed practical and predictable enough. I was 31 then, a mechanical engineer at a mid-sized company in Columbus. I earned a steady income, kept my head down, paid what I owed on time. I wasn't chasing ambition or reinvention. I just wanted a life that felt stable and reasonable. For a while, my marriage to Lillian Hart seemed exactly that. Lillian had a kind of intelligence that shifted the balance in any room she entered. Within minutes, people would lean toward her without realizing it, nodding along even if they had disagreed moments earlier. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and moved upward fast, always sharply dressed, always 2 steps ahead, always planning something. When we married, I remember thinking I had chosen someone who would never let our life slip into chaos. She was too organized, too driven, too controlled for things to fall apart around her. I admired that certainty in her. And if I'm honest, I was also a little afraid of it, afraid of what it might feel like to stand on the wrong side of that sharp, relentless mind. And then there was Sophie, Lillian's younger sister. She was 20 when everything broke apart. A congenital condition had left her dependent on a wheelchair and on other people for most of the small mechanics of daily life, bathing, dressing, moving between bed and chair. After their parents died in a car accident when Sophie was 16, Lillian became her legal guardian. By the time Lillian and I married, Sophie was simply part of the arrangement. She lived in the spare bedroom of our apartment, quiet and unobtrusive, like an object that had always been there. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then her answers were brief and careful, as though she were measuring how much space she was allowed to occupy. She never complained. She never asked for anything extra. Whenever conversations turned toward her, she would drop her eyes to her lap and fold inward slightly, as if trying to shrink out of view before anyone could register the inconvenience of her existence. I want to be clear about one thing: I did care about Sophie. I helped lift her when Lillian was working late. I drove her to therapy appointments. If she mentioned wanting a book, I brought it home for her. I wasn't indifferent. But somewhere underneath that, I carried a quiet assumption that Sophie belonged to Lillian's side of life, not mine. I had married a woman, not her responsibility. And in the private logic I never spoke aloud, I believed that if my marriage ever ended, Sophie's care would return to where it originated. That was the unspoken agreement I kept in my own head. Lillian never knew about it. Sophie probably did. The morning after I signed the lease, I woke to a bed that was half cold. Lillian's side hadn't been slept in. Her closet door stood open, hangers spaced too far apart. The bathroom counter was cleared of the things that had always been hers: no perfume bottle, no makeup bag, no hairbrush tangled with strands of dark hair. At first I thought she had left early for work. Then I saw the kitchen table. The divorce papers lay neatly aligned at its center, her signature already in place. The yellow note sat on top, held down by the corner of the last page. 5 words, written in the same controlled handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards. "Take care of Sophie, I can't." I called her phone immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again, and again. By the 10th attempt my voice had started to crack without my permission. I sent messages, angry, confused, then simply, "Call me." Nothing came back. When I phoned her office, the receptionist hesitated before telling me Lillian had submitted her resignation 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks, She had been arranging her exit while I compared apartment layouts and talked about where we'd put the couch. By noon, I logged into our bank account and felt the last illusion collapse. Over the previous month, money had been slipping out in small transfers, amounts just low enough to escape attention. What remained wouldn't cover 2 months of rent. That was when the full shape of it settled in. Lillian hadn't fled in a moment of panic. She had constructed a way out piece by piece, job, money, timing, until every door was already closed by the time I woke up. And she had left Sophie behind with the certainty that I wouldn't abandon a 20-year-old woman who had nowhere else to go. She hadn't only ended our marriage. She had designed it so I couldn't follow her. Sophie never asked me what had happened that morning. She remained in the living room, hands folded loosely in her lap, gaze fixed on the window as if the world outside required all her attention. I'm certain she heard me making the calls, the repetition, the rising edge in my voice, the silence that followed each attempt. But she didn't turn toward me. She didn't ask questions, she didn't say Lillian's name. When I finally sat down across from her, she looked at me once. What I saw in her expression wasn't confusion or grief, it was recognition. A quiet, practiced awareness, like someone who had seen this pattern before and already knew how it ended. For 3 days I moved through the apartment in a state that felt half awake. I went to work, came home, cooked 2 portions of dinner and ate across from her in near silence. The divorce papers stayed on the kitchen table, untouched like an object too volatile to handle. Sophie never mentioned them. She never asked what I planned to do about her. She didn't plead, she didn't cry. She didn't try to make herself useful or agreeable to secure her place. She simply remained, small, careful, unobtrusive, the way someone learns to exist when they believe their presence alone is already too much. On the 4th evening, a coworker named Greg took me out for beer and asked the question everyone else had avoided. "What are you going to do about her?" I told him I didn't know. He spoke gently, not unkindly. There were state programs, he said, assisted living placements, group homes. I wasn't her brother, wasn't her father, had no legal duty. People say things like that when they're offering you permission to choose the easier path. And he wasn't wrong. Legally, Sophie was nothing to me. I could have called social services, explained that her guardian had abandoned her, signed whatever forms were required and stepped away with clean hands. No one would have blamed me. Some might even have called it reasonable. That night, when I opened the apartment door, I found Sophie in the hallway near the entrance. Not in the living room where she usually stayed. Right by the door, her wheelchair angled slightly toward it, as if she had positioned herself to watch for my return, or my absence. She looked up when she heard me, and in that moment something settled the decision for me. It wasn't hope in her eyes, it wasn't gratitude. It was terror. Not the loud kind. The quiet, bone-deep kind that belongs to someone who already knows what abandonment feels like, who has survived it once and understands they might not survive it again. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. I closed the door behind me, set my keys on the counter, and lowered myself onto the floor beside her chair. I didn't give a speech, I didn't promise anything grand. I just said, "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie." She turned her face away from me. Her shoulders trembled once, only once, before going still again. That was the moment the shape of my life changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a quiet, irreversible way. I chose a future I had never imagined, tied to someone who wasn't mine by blood or obligation, but who had no one else willing to stay. Choosing her was the simple part. Everything that followed was not. The paperwork began a week later. I hadn't planned to become anyone's guardian. I barely understood what that meant beyond the word itself. But when I started calling agencies, explaining that a disabled adult had been abandoned in my care, the language changed quickly. They didn't ask whether I wanted responsibility. They asked whether I was prepared to assume it. Prepared was the wrong word. The process was long, bureaucratic, and quietly invasive. Social workers came to the apartment to assess the environment. They inspected the bathroom rails, the doorway widths, the kitchen layout. They asked about my income, my hours, my health, my intentions. Sophie sat nearby during each visit, hands folded, gaze lowered, answering only when addressed directly. "Do you feel safe here, Sophie?" "Yes." "Do you want to remain with him?" A pause, then yes. Each time she spoke, it felt less like consent, and more like a fragile thread she was afraid to drop. Court hearings followed. I stood before a judge who reviewed statements about abandonment, capacity, and care requirements. Lillian's absence hung over every page. Officially, she was listed as unreachable, unresponsive, location unknown. Unofficially, she had erased herself. When the guardianship order was finally granted, the document used formal language, permanent care authority. It sounded heavier than any promise I could have spoken aloud. Life adjusted around that decision, but not gracefully. My work hours shrank because someone had to be home for medical appointments, equipment deliveries, therapy sessions. Bills expanded to fill every gap my reduced income created: mobility repairs, prescriptions, adaptive furniture, transport. I learned the costs of everything required to keep a person comfortable, dignified, safe. Sophie never complained. That almost made it harder. She apologized for things that weren't burdens: the time transfers took, the slowness of mornings, the space her chair required in narrow aisles. She thanked me for ordinary acts: passing a glass of water, adjusting a blanket, waiting while she finished a sentence. The first time she said, "You don't have to do this," I understood something I hadn't before. She believed care was temporary, conditional, revocable. So I stopped answering with reassurance and started answering with routine. Consistency, presence. I showed up at the same times. I cooked the same dinners on the same nights. I scheduled appointments months ahead and kept them. I repaired what broke. I stayed. Trust didn't arrive as gratitude or affection. It arrived as absence of fear. I noticed it slowly. The way she began leaving her room door open, the way her shoulders stopped tightening when I entered, the way silence between us changed from guarded to restful. 7 years passed like that, not easily, not heroically, but steadily. Our life never resembled the one I had planned, yet it became its own quiet structure. Work, care, meals, evenings, the soft rhythms of coexistence built on endurance rather than choice. Then last month, something from the life before stepped back into view. And everything we had built shifted again. I wasn't supposed to be in that building. The conference had relocated at the last minute due to renovations at the original venue. I arrived late, irritated, juggling a laptop bag and a paper cup of coffee while scanning unfamiliar signage. The lobby was crowded with professionals moving in intersecting currents: badges, briefcases, polite urgency. I was focused on finding the registration desk when I heard my name. Not the shortened version colleagues used, not the casual one friends preferred. My full name, spoken softly, as if tested for accuracy after years of disuse. I turned. For a moment, recognition lagged behind sight. Memory expects people to remain fixed at the age you last saw them. Reality doesn't honor that expectation. Lillian stood near the corridor entrance, one hand still half raised from calling out. Time had altered her in subtle, cumulative ways: sharper lines at the mouth, a composure that looked practiced rather than natural. But there was no mistaking her. 7 years collapsed into a single instant of shared awareness. Neither of us spoke immediately. The noise of the lobby seemed to thin around us, as if distance had formed without either of us moving. Then her eyes shifted past me. It happened in stages: curiosity first, who I might be with, then confusion, the mind trying to place an unfamiliar figure, and finally recognition landing with full force. All the colour left her face. Behind me, Sophie waited in her chair, exactly where I had asked her to pause while I checked the schedule. She had insisted on coming that morning, rare for her, but she'd wanted to see the city beyond our usual routes. She sat quietly now, hands resting on the armrests, gaze steady. She recognized Lillian immediately. Of course she did. Sophie had changed too. Older, thinner, features settled into an adult stillness that childhood hadn't allowed. But the essential map of her face was unchanged. Anyone who had once known her would know her again. The three of us stood in a line of sight that had been broken for 7 years. Lillian's lips parted. No sound came out. Her eyes moved between us, searching for an explanation that rearranged reality into something survivable. I stepped slightly aside, not to present Sophie, not deliberately, just enough that nothing obscured the truth of who stood there. Sophie did not look away. She didn't smile, she didn't accuse, she didn't speak. She simply met her sister's gaze with a calm that contained no invitation and no retreat. It was the calm of someone who had already lived through the worst thing the other person could do. "Hello, Lillian," I said. My voice sounded ordinary. That surprised me more than anything else. Lillian's eyes lingered on Sophie, and for the first time in years I saw uncertainty in her expression. It wasn't fear exactly, but something sharper, Recognition, maybe, that the quiet control she had once assumed was no longer hers to wield. I could see it unfold in the subtle shifts of her posture. A pause in her step, a slight tightening of her jaw, a glance that darted between Sophie and me as if calculating her options. She had rehearsed this moment, imagined it many times in the safety of her own mind, yet she clearly hadn't predicted this presence, this quiet, steady reality she had abandoned. I didn't speak again. Sophie didn't either. The room carried the weight of 7 years, unspoken but palpable, each second stretching the past into the present. Finally, Lillian broke the silence. Her voice was measured, practiced, but there was a tremor beneath the control. "Nathan, I." She stopped, swallowed, and the words caught somewhere between apology and excuse. Sophie, still seated in her wheelchair, looked straight at her. No flinching, no shrinking. The gaze alone said enough. Sophie had seen everything before, and she wasn't afraid this time. I realized in that moment that nothing Lillian could say would undo the years that had passed, the lives that had been built in her absence, or the independence Sophie had claimed for herself. The room no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to the present, and to the young woman who had quietly grown into someone strong enough to face the sister who had left her behind. The years following Lillian's disappearance weren't easy, but they shaped Sophie in ways no one could have predicted. It started with small things. She began asking questions during her therapy sessions, curious about her own progress. Can I try this stretch on my own? Or what happens if I practice this at home? For the first time, she was initiating the conversation about her care. I didn't realize at first how monumental it was. I only nodded and drove her home. Then the changes grew bolder. She started using the adaptive kitchen tools I'd purchased months before, untouched until now. Scrambled eggs, toast, sandwiches. She wheeled herself to the mailbox each morning, a task Lillian had always handled. One evening I found her at the kitchen table with her laptop open, researching online certificate programs for graphic design. She looked up and said simply, "I think I want to try this." 4 years with Lillian and Sophie had never voiced what she wanted. 6 months with me, and she was beginning to discover it for herself. That was when I realized the most important lesson. Sophie didn't need someone to carry her through life, fight insurance battles, or make sacrifices silently. What she needed, and what I could finally give, was something far more difficult to provide. She needed to be seen as a person with a future, not a problem to manage. Lillian had cared for Sophie efficiently, dutifully, but with a quiet resentment that she never admitted aloud. I wasn't perfect, but I asked the question Lillian never had. "What do you want?" That simple inquiry opened a door Sophie had been waiting for someone to unlock. By the 3rd year, Sophie had completed her graphic design certificate online. She took on freelance projects, logos for local businesses, social media layouts for non-profits. She followed her own therapy routine without reminders. We moved into a 1st-floor apartment, fully accessible with wider doorways and a roll-in shower. Guardianship paperwork was finalized. Life remained difficult, but it had a shape I could recognize. Sophie was no longer defined by fear, silence, or abandonment. She was building a life she owned. Then, out of nowhere, Lillian returned, not in person but through a letter from a lawyer. The letter claimed that she was now ready to resume caregiving for Sophie, citing improvements in her own life and a deep concern for her sister's future. She requested a meeting to discuss the transition. I read the words 3 times, each pass making the ground feel like it was shifting beneath me. 3 years of silence, not a single call, not a birthday card, not even an email. And now she wanted to step back into the role she had abandoned overnight. I contacted my lawyer, Donald Pratt, who had helped with Sophie's guardianship. He explained that as Sophie's biological sister and former legal guardian, Lillian had a credible claim, especially if she could prove her circumstances had changed and that she was fit to provide care. Courts tend to favor blood relatives. He paused, then added something that stuck with me. In my experience, people don't come back for the person, they come back for the story. It made sense. Lillian had constructed a narrative of the exhausted, self-sacrificing caregiver. Taking Sophie back now would complete that story, proof that she had always intended to return once she had healed, erasing any perception of abandonment. I couldn't tell Sophie right away. She had finally begun to thrive, freelancing, laughing, building a small but real sense of independence. I feared what the news would do to her. But she discovered the letter herself, finding it in my briefcase when she needed a pen. She read it at the kitchen table. Later, I came home to find her once again in the hallway near the front door, the same place she had waited for me 3 years earlier. But this time the look in her eyes was not terror. It was something older, harder. She looked at me and said, "She doesn't get to do this." Lillian's legal maneuver was more aggressive than I had anticipated. Within a month, she had retained a family attorney in Columbus and filed a formal petition to modify the guardianship. Her filings painted a picture I barely recognized: a devoted sister forced to step away due to a mental health crisis, now fully recovered, ready to provide Sophie the family connection she deserved. There was also an allegation I had to read twice, that I had isolated Sophie from her biological family and that my guardianship should be reconsidered. My lawyer, Donald, urged me to remain calm. But calm was hard to find. On paper, Lillian looked stable, financially secure, and emotionally ready. On paper, I was a 35-year-old single man, no blood relation, surviving on freelance work with an unpredictable income. The court knew nothing of the bank transfers, the careful planning of her disappearance, or the stories Lillian had spun for friends. All they would see was a sister seeking to return. The turning point came when social workers arrived for a home evaluation and independent assessment of Sophie's living conditions and well-being. Two professional women, polite but probing, asked questions meant to uncover any hidden restrictions. Do you feel limited in this home? Do you miss your sister? Has anyone encouraged you to speak negatively about Lillian? Sophie answered calmly and honestly. But beneath her words the old fear surfaced, the way her eyes fell, her hands tightened. She was 24, facing strangers who judged her life, questioning the home she had built for herself. After the evaluators left, I sat alone in the car, exhausted. I had spent 4 years reconstructing life from the wreckage Lillian left. Money, time, sleep, my career path, all poured into this new reality. And now one legal filing threatened to unravel it. If Lillian succeeded, Sophie would return to someone who had proven she could leave without a backward glance. The young woman who had just started laughing again, building her own life, would relearn the lesson that her existence was something to be managed, carried, or abandoned at someone else's convenience. For the first time since Lillian walked out, I felt the fear of losing. The legal battle dragged into its 6th year, depositions, motions, evaluations, continuances, each costing money I didn't have and sleep I couldn't spare. Donald advised focus and patience, but somewhere along the way, I began losing sight of why I was fighting. Originally it had been simple: protect Sophie. But by year 6, with every allegation from Lillian landing like a blow, I realized my anger was shifting. I no longer only wanted to defend her, I wanted to defeat Lillian. I wanted her story to crumble, to feel the same loss she had imposed on us. Sophie noticed before I did. One evening I was sprawled across the kitchen table, going through a folder of documents Donald had sent: bank records, Lillian's employment history, a timeline of her transfers. I spoke aloud to organize my thoughts, plotting how we could prove her exit had been planned for over a year. Sophie paused from her freelance project. Her gaze, steady and calm, met mine. "Nathan," she said, "I need you to hear something. If you go in there trying to destroy her, you are going to use me to do it. And I don't want to be used again, not by her, not by you." Her words hit harder than anything Lillian had ever done. She was right. I had been so focused on exposing Lillian that I had stopped asking Sophie what she wanted. I was treating her like a piece in a game, just as Lillian had done, instead of a person with her own voice. The distinction was clear. Lillian had used Sophie to justify leaving. I could have been using her to justify anger. Different motive, same result. Sophie would end up as evidence in someone else's story instead of authoring her own life. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. We both understood the truth in her words. That night I called Donald and told him to change our strategy. No offense, no digging for ammunition. We would enter the hearing to do one thing only: show who Sophie had become and let her speak for herself. Donald cautioned that judges respond to evidence, not philosophy. I told him firmly, Sophie's life over the past 6 years was the evidence. Nothing else would surpass it. The guardianship review hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in October, nearly 7 years after Lillian had disappeared. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lit, and cold, the kind of space where every moment feels temporary and heavy at the same time. Lillian was already there when we arrived, immaculate and composed. A new coat, carefully applied makeup, her husband Trent seated behind her in the gallery. She looked every bit the woman who had rehearsed this moment for years. Her lawyer had a thick folder on the table. She was ready to retell the story she had been shaping since the night she left. I entered with Sophie beside me. Lillian's eyes went straight to her. For a brief moment something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even disbelief at how different Sophie appeared. Healthier, more confident, steadier than the frightened young woman she had abandoned. Then Lillian's gaze shifted to the doorway behind us. That's when her expression changed completely. Rachel Simmons, Sophie's physical therapist since the beginning, stepped in, now credentialed as a disability advocate and independent care coordinator. Beside her was Janet Keller, a disability rights attorney who had taken Sophie's case pro bono. Behind them stood Patrick D.S., director of the independent living program Sophie had joined 6 months earlier. They were not there to argue with Lillian. They were there for Sophie, armed with nearly 7 years of documentation, therapy records, academic transcripts, samples of freelance work, financial plans showing she had begun earning, and a detailed proposal for her independent life. Everything was verified and signed by professionals who had watched Sophie transform from a quiet, fearful girl into a 27-year-old woman leading her own life. Lillian's lawyer opened his folder and began to speak, but the room had already shifted. Every argument about Lillian's preparedness was met with the undeniable reality. Sophie no longer needed anyone to care for her. She needed support, respect, and space to lead her life, and she had all three. When the judge asked Sophie if she wanted to speak, she wheeled herself forward. Without notes, without looking at me or Lillian, she spoke clearly. I am grateful to Nathan for choosing to stay when he had every reason to leave. I understand my sister struggled and I am not here to condemn her. But I am not a burden, I am not a prop. I have my own story. I am asking this court to let me live it. The judge granted her request. The petition to modify the guardianship was denied. Sophie's life, built on years of resilience and care, remained hers to lead. After the hearing, Lillian stood outside on the courthouse sidewalk. Her husband was already walking toward the car. Neither of us approached the other. But as Sophie and I passed, I saw her look, really look, at her sister. For the first time in years, I saw something break behind Lillian's eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, something heavier, the weight of truth. She had been running since the night she left, telling herself that Sophie would always be a burden and that the only way to survive was to let go. But Sophie was here. Strong, independent, employed, speaking for herself in a courtroom. The lie that had underpinned Lillian's escape was standing before her, dismantled without a single word needed. Lillian left that day. I don't know where she went. I didn't follow up. I didn't call. I didn't need to. Revenge would never give me what I truly wanted. What I wanted was simple: Sophie to be safe, respected, and empowered to define her own life. And now she had all of that, not because of me, but because someone finally stepped aside and let her lead. Sophie is 27 now. She lives in a supported apartment, just 12 minutes from her freelance graphic design work. She calls me every Sunday evening to talk about her projects, her clients, and whatever else is happening in her world. She is not my daughter. She is not my sister. She is not my obligation. She is a person I chose to stand beside when no one else would, and in doing so she taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. The people this world calls burdens are only burdens when we refuse to see them as humans with the right to grow, to choose, and to live with dignity. Sophie's life is proof of that truth.